Okay, so as I was saying, thank you everybody for being here. We'll welcome people in as they arrive. To start our Superintendent's Budget Advisory Task Force, we're going to quickly just review our meeting norms, which we have revised recently, but to give you a review of where we are with those, the norms as we agreed to in the last session were to start and stop on time, to focus on the problem and not the person, the use of discretion, one person can speak at a time, assume all have the best intentions. The agenda is created by representatives of this task force with input from other groups. Keep an open mind. Pre-reads circulated to all in preparation for the meeting. Everyone at the table are equals. Respect others. Suggestions or points of view. Understand and think through with no emotion. As a trustee, listen, take a step back, assess current processes, and hear new ideas generated from the group. So those are our norms, which we also confined to a little bit. We can find those a little bit from where we were. We also have goals, and we have 4 key goals: develop an understanding of the district's budget and financial issues, recommend to the Board of Education through the superintendent ideas related to reducing expenditures or increasing revenues towards a more balanced and focused budget, contribute to improved communication to enhance understanding of the district's budget and financial condition, contribute to and support a transparent and collaborative budget process. So in looking at those last 2 goals, that will kind of be a big focus area for our discussion today. So before we move into the other parts of our agenda, are there any opening comments or questions from the group before we get started to the heart of our agenda? Okay. Not seeing any. We will continue down. And before we do that, just a couple updates that aren't on the agenda, but just some verbal updates for everybody. As you know, we've had a conditional budget approval thus far. We reviewed that in one of our prior budget task force meetings. Wanted to let you know that since our last meeting, we did hear from the Alameda County Office of Ed, and they have approved our budget. So we are through that conditional portion of the approval. And just as a preview of things to come, our next budget time marker, so to speak, is the first interim budget report, which will be presented in December. So remembering that the first interim is a progress report only of our budget, and it's only a snapshot in time. So that will come forward in December. And last thing I'll go over is just as an update. If you were watching the governor's press conference today, you may have heard it, but we've also been tracking this at the state level. This is non-COVID tier related, but since we're talking about the governor's press conference, obviously you heard that we are moving back into the purple tier. But outside of that front, the governor also mentioned that revenues continue to be up above projections across the state so far. And what we've been tracking is that that continues to be the case, but we have to wait and see what that actually means. The governor alluded to the fact that he has been working very hard on his January budget proposal already. And so we'll have to see what all of that means for K-12 schooling and what happens with the state budget related to a number of things under this pandemic. Outside of that, moving into our agenda itself, you'll see a link for review of suggested questions for survey, and below that, a link of suggested information for the survey. Patty, are you able to pull that up on a shared screen so we can just share it with the task force members?
I'm sorry, are we on the, I'm dealing with something else, but is this a presentation?
No, this is the suggested.
Oh, yes. Give me just a moment.
Thank you.
And I'm sharing my screen. Can everyone see that?
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
So just to review this real quickly with everybody. As you can see, we asked if there were 3 questions you might want to see on the survey that we send out to the community. And one of the submitted questions was, are there any expenses you've seen in the past that you would like to avoid in the future? And then we also asked at the end of the last session, if there were 3 pieces of information you would like to see in the community presentation, what would those be? And those are listed below. As Patty's scrolling up, we can see that there were 4 submissions in this area. I won't read them to everybody. I'll give you a chance to look through them yourself. So these are the things that have been submitted from task force members, and certainly very important that we reflect on these inquiries and these suggestions from our task force members and consider how we can build those into the work that we do in the community presentations. Patty, if you want to stop sharing that screen, that would be fine. And is there a way, Patty, just for the task force to know if they want to continue to submit any questions or suggestions? Is that still open? Okay, I'm seeing you say yes.
Yes, it is.
Okay. Thanks so much. In moving into the next part of our agenda, which is really the bulk of where we will spend our time, as I said earlier, it goes back to the task force goals. The 2 goals that I think this addresses the most are contributing and supporting a transparent and collaborative budget process, and contribute to improved communication to enhance understanding of the district's budget and financial condition. So to give us an update of where we are, we've talked about this previously, but since our last meeting, we have engaged, by we, I mean the executive cabinet, myself, Associate Superintendent Battle, Assistant Superintendent Dr. Zamora, and Assistant Superintendent Ms. Salinas. We have been meeting with all of our employee groups and our management association and our Surfboard E leadership group. And we have met with them to review our budget kind of fiscal condition. And we've presented a rough framework of our budget assumptions. We spent most of our time discussing what questions they might have, or ideas that they might have, or things that they would like us to consider as we move forward with hitting the target of an $11 million reduction. And remembering that 11 million is the number identified based on the budget information we had at budget adoption. And that is what we passed as part of our board resolution. If that number is going to change in the future, the 2 points where we may see that indication would either be at first interim or a projection of a potential change at the governor's January budget. Now, we'll see how much either one of those comes to fruition. Again, the first interim is a very early snapshot. Normally, we have a greater sense of our budget and progress towards the budget numbers at second interim, but oftentimes we can identify some things at first interim. And so I think those meetings have been fairly productive. I think they've been full of good conversation and good dialogue, given the leadership team lots of things to think about as we prepare for our community town hall budget workshops. And we have those scheduled in the next few weeks. I believe, Patty, if you can confirm, I think we have 5 of them scheduled, one for each attendance area.
We do. So today the flyer will be released. The first of 2 flyers. One of them basically, or today's will be stating exactly what Superintendent just announced. And then I believe we're hoping by Wednesday, we will be able to confirm the dates, but we are looking at the last week of November to host 2 sessions and the first week of December to host the additional 3 sessions, all by attendance area.
Thank you. So what I'd like for us to do today is I'm going to ask Associate Superintendent Battle to review a draft of the town hall presentation. And what I would like you to do as a task force member is not necessarily look at this with the lens of sitting back and receiving the presentation, but I've asked Mr. Battle to present this information in terms of describing to you what information we're trying to deliver and what information we think is important for the community to have to make it an authentic and meaningful process. So it won't be necessarily where we're asking you to just sit through the presentation, but we're going to try and be very interactive in this so that we can gather your feedback and information as we go through to make sure that when we deliver this product, it's reflective of your feedback, A, and B, something that will be important and meaningful for the community. Now, we obviously are streaming this, and so there may be members of the community watching now that might see this, which is fine. It is, part of our process for how we're engaging in a collaborative budget conversation. So at this time, I'm going to ask Mr. Battle to begin going through that presentation with our task force. And Patty's going to share that on the screen so that you can see it. It's also linked on your agenda if you prefer to open it up on your screen and follow along.
Thank you, CJ, and good afternoon, everyone. So as CJ said, I'm going to kind of go through this draft budget workshop material with this group. And what I'll do, I think it'll be better and more expedient if you have a particular question or if you have a particular feedback as we go through the slides. It'd probably be good to stop there, and then we can go on to the next one. So we've sequenced this to kind of tell our district story, kind of explain where we are and what actions the board has taken at this point. So we start off the community presentation with basically our resolution. So this resolution is what's basically dictating the activities that we are now taking as a district. And you can see that it does provide for reductions beginning in 21-22 of 11 million and an additional 15 million in 22-23. So that kind of starts off with the authorities and the understandings on making the required reductions. Okay. Then here we just put it in a little context. The reductions process is really not it's not something new. Since 2000, last year in 2018-19, the board made a series of reductions beginning in 1920, and you can see those outlined here. And that's because of the pressures that were on the budget at that time in 18-19 going into 19-20. And you can see there's a total of 12.8 million in actions on May 22nd. And I'm not going to go through the detail of the actions. I'm sure everybody that was here at that time are familiar with these reductions. And we can go to the next slide. But of course, in the community meeting, we'll go into a little bit more detail just to touch on some of those, but I'm sure everybody here is familiar with this. Then on June 5th, there were additional reductions added. And then there were some one-time reductions. So the total reductions for 1920 were 16.3 million. So this kind of starts and puts some context to the conversation about reductions that, we unfortunately, we've had to make these reductions, which would be now going on 3 years, but that was the first year. We can go to the next slide, Patty. So here is the reductions we made for 2021. And you can see some of the items here that dealt with facilities and CNS price increases. We had made some assumptions around salary savings and reducing contracts. So those all totaled about 18.7 million. I will tell this group that we are currently evaluating these reductions, and these numbers are going to change because, as you know, we're not in session right now. So some of these cost savings were based on live instruction, like facility rentals, because we're not open, our meal price increases, things like that. So we are going to be updating this for first interim, but that kind of shows what actions we've taken for 2021. And here is an important chart. When we develop the budget, we have a set of assumptions. These are information that we get from School Services of California, and School Services is really the conduit of the information for all K-12 districts. So they are part of a statewide consortium and of county offices, and they meet to develop the assumptions that all districts use. The only assumptions that they don't prepare for us is our enrollment. Our enrollment is based on our updated demographic information, and then our unduplicated count, which is the percentage of students that qualify for supplemental services, and that would be our free and reduced students, migrant ed, and homeless, and students that fall into those categories. We get a percentage of funding based on the number of students in those categories. And then we have to make assumptions. The rest of this information is pretty much information we get from School Services. And like I said, they work very closely with the state and county offices on COLA. You know, we're on a zero COLA, and zero is projected for 21-22. Now, of course, this is all going to change at once the governor announces his budget. These numbers will be updated based on the governor's budget. But here you can see some of the assumptions around STRS, the employer portion of STRS, which is our pension cost that we pay for our employees. Same thing with PERS. And then we do get some lottery revenue, and you can see there per ADA, and then health and welfare, which we have zero there, and you see some questions related, comments related to minimum wages. Sure, Joyce.
Marcus, if I can stop 1 second, and it looks like Joyce may have a question about this slide too, but before we get to Joyce's question, I wanted to ask the group, when we look at this slide, as members of the Budget Task Force, you may be very familiar with a lot of the budget terminology and discussion. Are there questions or thoughts about this slide in terms of additional context that the general community may want to hear or understand more about this? So something to think about for the moment while we listen to Joyce's question, and then we'll go back to the one that I just asked. Joyce, what's your comment or question?
Hi, Marcus, can you define what health and welfare is as it relates to this item on your budget? I mean, what does it cover?
Well, because our district, the benefits actually are, I guess years ago, were part of, were added to employee salaries. So if we were paying a portion of employee health benefits, then that's where that would show up. Let's say if we were splitting that cost, but as we know in this district, the employee pays 100% of the cost.
I don't think that's true. I think that there's some kind of, at least for CSEA, there's some kind of amount you put towards our benefits that's built into our salary schedule. It used to be a separate, go ahead.
Yeah, let me ask, we have our budget director on here. Rice, you have any comments on this?
So yeah, I think you're both saying the right thing, Marcus and Joyce, that those benefits were rolled into salary schedules, and they are not increasing every year because the premium cost increases. Because if we have health benefit premiums from both sides, employer and employee side, they increase when the insurance company increases premium. In our case, employee is paying 100% of the cost as we speak. They're not paying that separately. It's part of the salary schedule. That's the reason we don't show that separately.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Joyce. And
That might go back to your question, CJ, about, showing this to the public. They might want to know more what all of these mean, and especially lottery. That comes up a lot in the public,
And I was going to say, CJ, what we can do, what I've seen with these type of presentations, we can do a glossary of terms. So some of the terminology that we use, we could just put some definitions of what they mean, which might help.
yeah, and I think it's just great to hear from our task force group in this moment to say, here's some things that jump out, because that tells us when we engage our community to make sure that we give some more context to some of these, because I think, as Joyce was saying, lottery is something that I hear quite a lot in public discussion. Where's all your lottery money? Because there's a perception that we get a ton of money from lottery funds, when in reality, that money has been decreasing for a long time. And it's a very, very small part of our funding. And I think the health and welfare increase is another important part. I think there's different assumptions throughout the state, throughout the community about what different health and welfare programs or packages exist for our employees. I see another hand. Go ahead, Sheila.
What is unduplicated count? I might have missed that.
Great question. Our unduplicated count is part of the local control funding formula at the state level. And that funding formula provides that school districts get a certain amount of additional funding based on their unduplicated count. And your unduplicated count is a calculation of students within your school district who, for example, might be Title I students. They might be English language learners. Foster youth is another category. And the reason they call it unduplicated is because if a student happens to qualify in all three of those areas, you can only count that student once. And so that defines your unduplicated count. As you can see, ours is roughly around 27%, which means we qualify for a supplemental amount of funding. Districts that pass the 49% threshold and hit 50 or above, they get substantially more funding from the state. So that'll be an important definition, I think, as well. Thank you. If you want to keep going to the next slide, please.
So here is just the revenue slide. So we do get our revenue from several resources, and you can see as Superintendent just said, LCFF, which is, we'll probably need to write out some of these things, like I said, and have a glossary of terms. I think it'll be very helpful. But LCFF, local control funding formula, that's the primary source of funds for school districts. And then we do get some percentage, as you can see here, some amount of federal revenue. Then we get other state revenue, other local revenue, and then we have other financing sources. So we will also be able to talk about what's in these different types of revenue also. We'll have a glossary that'll kind of have some of the information. And then our expenses, and these are state accounting categories that we get, that you see here. So we have category certificated salaries, which is all of our folks that hold certificates, like our teachers and our administrators at the school site. And then classified salaries and benefits, books and supplies, services and contracts, capital outlay. Most of our capital expenses are part of our Measure E program. These would be items that fall outside of any measure, just be going for ongoing things like roof repair that are not part of the bond program or things like that. Then you have some other outgo, and that should say transfers out. You have to take that D off of there, and then other expenses. So this shows our total expenses. And here, this is always a good chart to look at because what it shows, if you know, if you're looking at certificated salaries being 49.4% of the budget, classified salaries 15.1, and employee benefits 19.4, you can see that just salaries and benefits make up almost 85% of our costs, which is why when we're looking at reductions, it's kind of hard to look at, focus on things that are outside of salaries and benefits because 85% of our budget, and you can see that small portion, 4.6%, books and supplies, and then we have some services and capital outlay, and then we have other expenses there, which really make up really small portions of our budget. So that's why it's a challenge when we're trying to make reductions and we're trying to not impact staff. And here, the other thing that we have to prepare as part of our budget is a multi-year projection. So here we have a projection of revenues and expenses. The one thing to note here is that in each of the next 3 years, we do not generate enough revenue to cover our expenses. And that's what's referred to as deficit spending. So you can see that in 2021-22, we have those projected reductions programmed into our budget. And you can see for 22-23, an additional 15 million, increasing that to 26.7. We are, as a district, we are required to meet our state minimum reserve requirement, which is 2%. Our board has authorized an additional 1%. So that's why you see 3% on the bottom there. We have to maintain a minimum of 3% in order for our budget to move forward and to get a positive certification from the county.
So Marcus, if I can stop us there for a minute again, thank
Just
you,
for a minute.
Patty. Just want to see if there's any questions or comments on this multi-year slide or any of the prior two slides.
Well, I have a big question about the total revenues because you've got 404.8 for 2020, but on slide 7, I thought it was 406.8. I can't quite follow the excess deficiency. If I've got expenditures of 410 and revenues of 404, I can't be at 3.6. Is what I'm seeing. The numbers don't seem to add up for me. And I don't know where you got the, speaking as a person looking at it, I don't know where you got the other revenue numbers from for multi-year.
Okay.
You're showing such a drop for next year, almost $20 million. Is it just?
Right, so it sounds like what I'm hearing is that as we need to put like differences like that in context when we're explaining it to the public. We need to make sure that we have the these, and the numbers should be tying. The 404.8, and this is a summary. Rice, do you know right off the top of your head why that particular first column isn't balancing?
No, Marcus, but as you mentioned, there's so much detail behind that. This is a very simplified version of the presentation. There's tons of detail behind that. I can follow up with an answer later on if you want me to.
Well, I think
Yeah,
I think it's good to follow up, but I think it's also good just to receive that feedback in terms of understanding the feedback that we received, and also just when we look at the total revenues in the multi-year, giving some additional context to why the total decrease, if that's reflective already of the 11 million reduction, or Marcus, for example, what are we looking at based on the dartboards that we see from school services or the legislative analyst office? So we can help describe that as well. Trustee Jones, did you also have a comment?
Yeah, I definitely think we need to explain to the community why the revenues are decreasing. And I'm guessing part of that, but I don't know how much of it, is a factor of our decreasing enrollment pattern.
Right.
And I'm not sure how much of it is attributed to that alone and what other factors are contributing to it. But, I think it's hard to understand, I think, for the general community, why a district like ours is going to be getting less money.
CJ, about the revenue reduction, I can answer that question, why revenue is going down.
Yeah,
Okay,
feel
so
free, Rais.
2021
And
fiscal year includes some one-time monies that came to us, that was the mechanism under CARES Act that came from federal government, about $16.4 million. That's one-time money in this year, in 2021. Next year, we have to take that out because that's only one-time money. That shows a drop in our revenues.
thank you. I think also, Trustee Jones, to your point, I think what may be helpful in terms of looking at the projections for revenue is I have seen sometimes in other budget presentations, other places where below that total revenue line is also an ADA projection. And I think it helps everybody understand that how tightly those two things are woven together, because people see an increase or a decrease in enrollment and they don't necessarily understand how uniquely tied that is to our funding at the state level. And so if we show that projection over those 3 years, it may help also continue to illustrate that concept for our community.
Right. And I think what happened, since we haven't been in a declining enrollment pattern for very long, our decline pattern, and of course this year, who can blame anybody? We had no idea what was going to happen with enrollment this year. But even from our enrollment projections, which we projected a decline, our actual enrollment was less than that even. And in a normal year, that would have had a much bigger impact on our budget than it did this year because we've got some grace. But I think the public also needs to understand that when we're running such a lean budget, if we have an enrollment projection decline and we have even a decline beyond the projection of, just say, 100 students in a district of our size, that can be, I don't know what 100 students amounts to, but it's a chunk of change. And so we really, I think, need to make sure we're working with our demographer so that we get on top of, and like I said, I know this year is challenging because who knows what was going to happen. But, we need to make sure that our enrollment projections are as accurate as they can be.
Yes, most certainly. And I think we actually, maybe a little bit later in the presentation, can help drive that conversation again with some of the slides that we have. But I've got 2 more hands. Let me go to Trustee Crosby.
Thank you. I think also when you have a cost of living increase that is not adequate, it means not only is it not adequate in the year that it's provided, and this sort of ends up being my, end up mentioning all the time, where you're in a situation where it's never our true cost of living. So the fact that they call it that is very political and has nothing. It sounds good for the governor to say he's giving us a cost of living, but it isn't. It has not been in a number of years been anything like the cost of living we would need for an adjustment in the Bay Area. I think that's significant in looking at, well, you've got a cost of living adjustment. Well, if the money isn't enough, it doesn't matter that we're provided additional funding.
Thank you. Most certainly agree. And I think Marcus has a slide on that next. But before we move on, I've got one more hand. Saikat, and if I'm not saying that wrong, please correct me. I want to make sure that I do get it right.
CJ, you got it correct. So this is Saikat here. So I'm speaking from the perspective of a FUSD parent. And so when one recommendation is when you are presenting these multi-year projections or pie chart of the expenses of the of FUSD, one recommendation is, going into the shoes of the parents in the community, giving them an idea of the spending per student and comparing that vis-a-vis with other school districts in the Bay Area would be helpful, as well as the overall certified teachers, average compensation, non-certificated staff compensation as compared to other school districts would also be probably more relevant context for the parents to understand and appreciate where the budgetary challenges are and how we are faring against other school districts here.
Thank you. That's very good information for us. And I think there's some opportunities for us to add that in. So moving on, Marcus, if you want to talk about the next slide with a COLA, I think as Trustee Crosby was pointing out, and then I think that we kind of start to get into that per student funding conversation, which I think is something that will be helpful, but I'd like your feedback as a group.
Yeah, and this slide just basically, in terms of the local control funding formula, one thing that we, as K-12 districts, we usually like to get a COLA with that. We generally get a statutory COLA, but because of the projections on the state level in the economic situation, although they enacted a 2.31% statutory COLA for the 2021 budget, they did not fund it, which created quite a and I can't I don't have the estimate of how much money that was, but it was quite a bit of money. And when the governor's budget was originally presented in January, that COLA was in there, so we had to take that out at the what's called the May revision in May when the governor updates his budget. So basically, what that says there is our LCFF funding was basically unchanged from 1920 to 2021. The difference in revenue that Rais spoke about in the previous slide was all due to the funding that we received from under CARES Act. If it were not for that funding, then we would have been flat funded, and that's why the next 2 years you see flat funding, because they're projecting no COLA increase.
Thanks. And that kind of goes to Trustee Crosby's comment about the COLA is, the headline might read 2.3% COLA, but when we actually get the funded budget, it has been a 0% COLA. In some years, we've even seen a negative or a deficit COLA. Trustee Jones, did you have a question or comment?
Yeah, I think it may also be important to share with the community that the way our salary structures work, that unless we have a year where we have a lot of folks who are at the top end of the salary scale retire, our salary costs increase generally every year because of step and column increases that are just built into the salary schedule. So even if we don't give, say, a negotiated raise, our salary costs go up regardless. And believe me, I think that's important. Our staff deserves that. So I don't want to make it sound like I'm criticizing that system, but our salary costs go up. And if we get zero COLA, we're working at a loss there that we have to figure out how to deal with. So, our choices, if we don't want to see our salary costs go up, we either have to hope that a lot of people at the top of the salary scale retire, or we have to look at, and I don't want this to happen either, but even just to keep our salary costs the same, potentially laying people off, which is horrible. But I think it's important for the community to understand that those salary costs generally go up year over year, even without a negotiated raise.
Yeah, and that could be something that we can add into the presentation. There's oftentimes an estimate that happens in the budget process for, kind of what we refer to as turning the page from one year to the next and servicing the salary schedule. And that sometimes can be anywhere from a range of 1% to 2%, depending on the district. So we can give some context to that as well to help the community understand it. On to the next slide, I think we start to then kind of lay out the LCFF funding factors. And I think, Marcus, I'll just kind of give this a little bit of a narrative. I think what this starts to highlight for individuals in the community is ultimately understanding what happens with our funding and the amount that we receive per student. And so you can see what happens on a year-to-year basis. And if you can go to the next slide, Ms. Sandoval, excuse me. Then we can also start to see, some of what happens when we get a grade span adjustment funding from the state. And we see that for our K through 3. And then if you scroll up a little bit, you can see it for our 9 through 12 students as well. And then on the third page of this cycle, if you go one more page up, we start to see what that supplemental does. So back when we were talking about our unduplicated percentage, if you look at the columns here in the 2021 adjusted per ADA, that is showing that in our current budget for each student is really one way to think about it. But remember, ADA is our average daily attendance, because we don't get funded just on enrollment. We get funded on a percentage of our average daily attendance. And that starts to show you what we receive as funding per student. But then you see the 20% supplemental grant, and the UPP is your unduplicated percentage. And you see that significant shift when you get to the 50% concentration. And I think it's important for everybody, but especially for our community, to understand that that's why there's some discrepancies in what districts receive around the state, and most certainly within the Bay Area. So what you're receiving from the state per student could vary drastically with some of your neighboring districts. Are there any questions about those 3 slides under the LCFF funding factors? Okay. And then in our next slides, we start to try and tell the narrative, and I want to confirm for our task force members that this will be conveyed in a way that is very objective, but I think it's important to understand this is not about laying any responsibility at anybody's feet within Fremont Unified School District, and helping people understand that everybody who works for Fremont Unified School District is either in the STRS category or the PERS category. And what we're looking at here are pension contributions. And the significant piece, which I think is helpful for people to understand in this, and the message we want to convey, is that if you look back at the 2013-14 number, school districts contributed 8.25% towards employee pensions. And this is something that's set by the state legislature. It is not something that Fremont Unified can control. It's not something that the Board of Education can control. And it's not something that any of our employee associations or unions can control. These percentages are specifically set by the legislature, and you can see the dramatic increase all the way up to 2021, where we're hitting 18. And that has been a remarkable cost increase for school districts across the state of California. And it has not been met with an adequate increase in revenue to fund that responsibility. And we'll highlight that in another 2 slides. Ms. Sandoval, if you can go to the next slide. So this is the other pension system, PERS. And these rates are set by a board, half elected, half appointed. It's a little bit different than the legislature, but it's the same problem. It's an unfunded pension liability at the state level. And you can see these percentages go from roughly 11.5 back in 2013 to almost 21% in the 2021 year. And so you can imagine how significant these cost increases are to public school districts across the state. And this was messaged a while back, about 7 or 8 years ago, when it really first started. And it's kind of gone away a little bit the last few years. And I think it's still really important to understand the significance of these cost increases for public school districts. And the next slide, I think, kind of demonstrates
Wait.
that, but I'd love the feedback from the task force in
Can I-
terms of.
I'm sorry, can I just interrupt for a sec? Can I just, before we go on to the next one, on 14, can we just go back?
Yeah.
I know I'm not understanding the percentage of increases.
Okay.
Because when I'm looking, I'm seeing for 2021, a negative 0.95.
Yeah,
Yes.
and we
Go ahead,
will,
Mark.
yeah, we'll make some adjustments to make sure this is clear. In 2021, we did get a little relief in regard to the rate of increase within the governor's budget. And I believe that's what's reflected there. Rice, can you confirm that for me? Just want to make sure.
Yes, these numbers are coming from School Services of California, and they are saying that based on STRS board, the board of STRS, they are going to make a negative adjustment to their rates.
And so another way to look at that is, and I'm not at all saying that this has anything to do with my advocacy at the state level, because it hasn't, and I don't have that kind of influence. But what I have said to individuals at the state level on a regular basis, and what I think the education sector has said on a regular basis, is the rate increase from 8.25 up to almost 20, where we're headed, is far too steep. And so
Yes.
in the past few budget cycles, we've seen a little bit of relief from the governor's budgets where they've turned back the percentages a little bit. So I don't have the number in front of me, but for example, in the 2021 year, it might have been that the rate was supposed to be 19.5 or 19.75%, and they dialed it back a little bit. So we see a little bit of relief based on what we were already projecting. Unfortunately, the problem is they never lowered the total. It just means they're changing the rate at which they get us there. But I think that's probably why you're seeing a reflection of a negative there, is because based on what was there, it's gone down a little bit temporarily.
So can we just have like an asterisk or something to, because that is just like, as you just had explained, get just a little clarity, because people will see, and then I mistrust a lot of the other numbers. Sorry, just.
No, I think that's great feedback. That's why we kind of wanted to go through this, is to receive this kind of feedback. And so going to the graph, I think it's 2 slides down.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. No, please stop. That's exactly why we wanted to kind of have it in this conversation format. And this will have to have some clarity, because this is from a graph that represents teacher pension payments. And I want to make sure that it's clearly understood this is not just about teachers, but when it reflects the STRS category, it's everybody who has a credential to do their job. What you can see here, what we're trying to highlight in this graph, is that in the orange tier, you can see the state's cost towards pensions started at 5% and has gone up to roughly just above 10%. And the reason teachers is on here is because even the employees who are under the STRS category, they used to also put towards their own pension 8.25%. And their own rate has gone up as well. So that has gone up, and you can see that. But in the blue line, you can most certainly see that school districts across the state of California have been shouldered with the greatest responsibility for funding this unfunded liability. And if you look back at our revenue increases from the state, they certainly don't match this percentage increase. And so that's one of the real challenges that's there. Any questions on that chart or feedback? So on the next graph, obviously this goes with the narrative that this is not about the students themselves. Some of our neediest students absolutely deserve and require, morally, ethically, and from a responsibility standpoint, should have absolutely everything they need to access their educational program. However, special education is not funded at the level which is required. The federal law, IDEA, was crafted with the spirit of IDEA funding 40% of special education costs. In my entire career, I've never seen it fund more than 16%. So you can see from a federal level, it's remarkably underfunded. Our state does the best that it can, but it also remains underfunded. And so what that means is school districts have to take money out of their general fund and make sure that they are supporting all of the needs of our special education programs and students, as we should. But that contribution from the general fund is a significant expenditure for school districts, which is part of what I would generally refer to as another unfunded mandate. But this helps to show that diagram, and you can see here that, Marcus, I don't know if you want to give any other context to this graph.
No, I mean, I think you said it well. I mean, the important thing is that red number is growing each year, and our the number of students that we have in the program is not growing in at the same level as the cost is increasing. So I think that's important. The cost of services are increasing for providing services to this group of students, and you can see that the funding that we're receiving is nowhere near on pace with the cost impact. So it's definitely and it's something that every school district in California has to contend with, and we just don't get enough federal revenue to support this program. So.
Trustee Jones?
Are we expecting any federal relief with the exit, not soon enough, of Betsy DeVos? Do you think with the new administration, we might see more of this funding federally?
That's a great question. I think we'll see a number of things start to change a bit at the federal level with the exit of the current Secretary of Education, but I don't know that we'll see a real increase in IDEA funding. That is something that generally needs to go through the legislature at the federal level, and even under the Obama administration, we didn't really see any significant uptick. And it's the other piece of my largest advocacy at the federal level with our elected representatives is we would be in a remarkably different fiscal position for schools if the mandate for special education was funded at the level it was intended, or if the state didn't shoulder school districts with the responsibility for handling the pension obligation. Sheila Rodriguez, please go ahead.
I just had a question. So is the reason the deficit is growing each year more due to the fact that there are more special education students to service and the cost that they're giving us is fairly stagnant? Is that why the deficit is growing?
Marcus may have a better history of this than I might. But my experience in other districts, and as I come to Fremont and look at Fremont, our overall percentage of students in the district that qualify for special education has stayed right around 9%, which is a really good number statewide. There's a lot of districts that are up around 12 or 13% of their student population. Most of what this is it's really just underfunding each year. And there are some complicated aspects of this where the cost for services just continue to go up remarkably for different programs.
Okay, so it's not that there's more students, it's that the cost for the services they're needing is going up.
Yes.
Okay, got it.
Yes.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why you've had some districts as part of their budget strategies was to kind of be able to grow or collaborate with other districts to provide services. So if you can have that collaboration, or if we were able to serve a broader net of students in some of these categories, then we probably could see some reduced costs.
So I think, just going back to what I was saying, this is just a really important part of the the budget conversation for each school district. And where I always feel tension around this, and some of it is internal, and some of you may not know this about me, but my younger sister was born with severe intellectual disabilities. And so I have gone through the journey of working with a sibling and someone who now is in in care, and just the light of my life and everything that is right in the world, in my opinion. But I have seen firsthand how this looks, and to see these programs underfunded is quite frustrating. And I think, to give it context again, there are some students that require a really, really high level of service, and those students deserve that service to be supported appropriately. And there's students who require a very minimal level of service. And the problem is that our current funding model really is always driven by this idea of cost per student, which is, as we approach this work as educators and as people who lead with heart, it just doesn't feel like the right way to ever have a conversation about what's right for kids. But it is a part of where we are. And I think the next slide is enrollment, which I think goes back to a point that Trustee Jones was making earlier, where we can help tie that in with some of our revenue discussions. And you can see this is the best information and projection we have right now. Again, it's a complete projection. We do have development that happens within our community, and it is happening now. But if that development doesn't generate families that also have school age children, it doesn't automatically result in an increase in our enrollment. So based on what you saw in the beginning slides with the LCFF funding, you can kind of see per student how that starts to impact us quite a bit. And then that kind of goes to the next two slides, which is a slide that we stole from CSBA from a publication they produced, which is just a little bit of some ratio about what is funding like in the state of California. And I think these are important numbers for people to look at. Again, this is pre-pandemic, but you can see, for being the fifth largest economy in the world, it's a bit remarkable that we fall this far behind in some of these statistical categories. And on the last slide, I think this starts to give some context as well. Again, with the caveat, this is all based on the laws of averages, which doesn't always pencil out when you do some budgeting. But if you just look at New York, which is one of the higher states of funding per student, and you can see their numbers back in 2019 were just under $20,000 per student. California's number on average, just over $10,000 per student. You can see, if a district like Fremont Unified were funded the way New York is funded, that we would see